There are people who don't just live in the world, they absorb it. Every emotion in the room, every unspoken tension, every hidden grief becomes theirs to carry. They feel the weight of conversations that never happened. They sense the storms brewing beneath calm surfaces, and for a long time they believe this is their gift, their purpose. Until one day, without warning, something inside them breaks, not loudly, not violently, but completely. This is not a story about weakness. It's about what happens when strength is mistaken for endurance, when compassion becomes a wound that never heals, when the act of feeling everything slowly erases the one who feels. We call them empaths, sensitive souls, the ones who understand too much, too quickly, too deeply. Society praises them in passing. You're so kind, so caring, so aware, but rarely asks what it costs to be the one who holds everyone else's pain. We celebrate their ability to see into the human heart, but we never wonder what happens when they look into their own and find it empty, hollowed out. A vessel that once overflowed now runs dry, and no one noticed when it started to crack. For years, they give. They listen when no one else will. They sit with discomfort that makes others flee. They become the safe place, the refuge, the one who always understands. And in return they receive a peculiar kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being seen as strong enough to never need support, wise enough to never be confused, stable enough to never collapse. People lean on them the way one leans against a wall, assuming it will always be there, never considering that walls too can crumble. The empath learns to smile through exhaustion. They learn to say, "I'm fine," when they're drowning. They learn to prioritize everyone else's emotional survival, while their own goes unexamined, unattended, slowly fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. And because they're so good at reading others, they become experts at hiding themselves. They know exactly what to say to deflect concern. They know how to perform wellness while inner worlds collapse. But here's the paradox no one tells them. The more deeply you understand others, the more isolated you become. Because true understanding requires you to step into perspectives that contradict your own, to hold space for realities you don't inhabit, to validate experiences that may dismiss or diminish yours. The empath becomes a bridge between worlds, but bridges don't have homes. They exist in the space between, never fully belonging anywhere, constantly translating, mediating, absorbing the impact of collision so others don't have to feel it. I once knew someone who could walk into a room and immediately sense who was hurting, who was pretending, who needed to be seen. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even special, really. It was simply the result of a childhood spent reading danger in silence, learning to predict storms by studying the stillness before them, developing a nervous system so finely tuned to threat that it never learned to rest. What others called intuition, she called survival. What they praised as gift, she experienced as curse. She would sit across from friends and see not just their words, but the wounds beneath them, the fears they couldn't name, the grief they'd buried under productivity and noise. And she would offer exactly what they needed. Not advice, but presence, not solutions, but understanding, not judgment, but a mirror that reflected their humanity back to them. And they would leave lighter, relieved, grateful. And she would remain heavier than before, carrying now not only her own complexities but fragments of theirs. No one taught her that empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment, that feeling everything doesn't make you responsible for fixing everything, that you can witness someone's pain without making it your own. These lessons don't come naturally to those whose earliest understanding of love was entangled with caretaking, whose sense of worth was built on being needed, whose identity formed around the ability to soothe, support, and save. And so the pattern continued. Year after year, relationship after relationship, crisis after crisis. She became known as the strong one, the wise one, the one who always knew what to say. Her phone filled with messages from people in distress, and she answered everyone. Even when answering meant postponing her own rest, her own processing, her own needs. Because to people like her, saying no feels like abandonment. Setting a boundary feels like cruelty. Choosing herself feels like betrayal, but the body keeps score. Even when the mind refuses to acknowledge exhaustion, even when the heart insists on one more conversation, one more rescue, one more sacrifice, the body knows. It knows when reserves have been depleted. It knows when the nervous system has been in survival mode for too long. It knows when empathy has turned from gift to weapon, a weapon pointed inward, slowly destroying the one who wields it. The signs appear gradually. Sleep becomes difficult, then impossible. The mind races at night, replaying conversations, analyzing dynamics, worrying about others, while neglecting the self that does the worrying. Food loses appeal. Hobbies feel pointless. Joy becomes a memory rather than an experience. The world takes on a grey quality, not dark exactly, but drained of colour, of vitality, of meaning. And still, the empath continues. Because stopping would mean letting others down. And letting others down is the one thing they've been trained to never do. They don't realize they're drowning, because they're so focused on keeping everyone else afloat. They don't notice the warning signs, because they've become experts at ignoring their own signals. And the people around them don't see it either, because the empath has become too skilled at hiding, too practiced at performing functionality, too committed to the role they've been given. Until one day, something shifts. A small moment, perhaps. A request that would normally receive immediate attention suddenly feels like an impossible demand. A message that would typically trigger concern now triggers nothing. No compassion, no curiosity, nothing. Just a vast, empty indifference. The switch that has been stuck in the on position for years suddenly flips to off. And it doesn't flip back. This is not a breakdown in the dramatic sense. There are no screaming matches, no public meltdowns, no obvious signs of crisis. It's quieter than that, more complete. The empath simply stops responding, stops caring, stops trying. They don't explain it because they can't. They barely understand it themselves. All they know is that the part of them that used to feel everything now feels nothing. The capacity to care has been exhausted, and what remains is a strange, hollow peace. People who relied on them react with confusion, then frustration, then anger. "What happened to you?" they ask. "You've changed." And they have, though not in the way others assume. They haven't become cruel or callous. They've simply reached the limit of what one nervous system can process, what one heart can hold, what one soul can sustain while still remaining intact. This moment, when the empath stops empathizing, terrifies everyone around them more than it should, because it reveals an uncomfortable truth, that what they valued was not the person, but the function, not the soul, but the service. The empath was loved for what they provided, not for who they were. And now that they've stopped providing, the love evaporates, replaced by accusations of selfishness, complaints about change, demands for the return of the person who gave endlessly and asked for nothing. But that person is gone. Not dead exactly. Just dissolved, used up, stretched so thin across so many others' needs that there's nothing left to cohere into a self. And the strangest part is the relief. Beneath the guilt, beneath the shame, beneath the fear of disappointing others, there's a quiet, profound relief. The burden has been set down. The performance has ended. The mask has cracked beyond repair. In the silence that follows, something unexpected happens. Not immediately, but gradually, slowly. A tiny voice emerges from the emptiness, one that's been waiting years, perhaps a lifetime, to be heard. It's the voice of the self that existed before empathy became identity, before caretaking became currency, before understanding others became more important than understanding oneself. This voice asks simple questions. What do I need? What do I want? What do I feel? And for the first time in years, maybe ever, there's space to answer honestly. Because all the space that was occupied by others' emotions, others' problems, others' needs, is now empty. And emptiness, it turns out, is not the same as nothingness. Emptiness is potential. Emptiness is the canvas before the painting, the silence before the song, the pause before the next breath. The journey back is not about becoming who they were before. That person is gone, and grief for that loss is necessary. But grief can coexist with relief. Mourning the past doesn't prevent building a future. The empath who snapped must now learn what most people learn much earlier. that love without self-love is depletion, that service without self-care is destruction, that giving without receiving is not virtue but violence, violence against the self. They must learn that boundaries are not walls but bridges, that saying no is not rejection but honesty, that prioritizing their own well-being is not selfishness but survival. These lessons feel foreign, even wrong, to someone whose entire identity was built on the opposite principles. But the alternative is clear now. Continue the old pattern and disappear completely, or risk the discomfort of transformation and discover what it means to exist as a whole person, not just a half-empty vessel for others' needs. Rebuilding is slow. There are days when the guilt returns, when the old impulse to rescue, to fix, to carry resurfaces. But each time it does, they practice something new, they feel it, acknowledge it, and choose differently. They send love instead of labor. They offer encouragement instead of energy. They wish others well and trust them to find their own way. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, they discover that people are more capable than the empath ever believed. That most people, when not given the option of outsourcing their emotional processing, actually rise to the occasion. That the helping wasn't always helping. Sometimes it was hindering. Sometimes the greatest gift is to step back and let others learn what the empath learned too late. That you cannot grow in someone else's shadow, even if that shadow is cast by care. The hardest part is not the external changes, but the internal ones. Unlearning the belief that worth equals usefulness. Releasing the identity of being the person everyone turns to. Accepting that some people will leave when the service stops, and that their leaving is information, not tragedy. Building a life based not on what others need, but on what brings genuine joy, rest, meaning. These shifts require more courage than years of self-sacrifice ever did. Because self-sacrifice is familiar. Self-honoring is foreign territory. But here's what no one tells you about setting down the burden of everyone else's emotions. You become lighter, yes, but you also become visible. For the first time, you're not hidden behind the role, not obscured by the performance of endless compassion. You're simply present as yourself, unadorned, undefended, uncertain. And that vulnerability is both terrifying and liberating. Because when you stop trying to be everything to everyone, you discover who you actually are when no one needs anything from you. Some relationships survive this transformation. The real ones. The ones where love was always reciprocal, where care flowed both ways, even if the empath couldn't receive it fully before. These relationships deepen, become more honest, more sustainable. But many relationships don't survive, and their ending, though painful, is clarity. It shows who loved the person and who loved the service, who valued the soul and who valued the solution. What emerges from this process is not a hardened heart, but a protected one. Not closed, but boundaried. Not indifferent, but discerning. The empath learns to feel without absorbing, to understand without owning, to care without carrying. They learn that true compassion includes self-compassion, that real strength includes the strength to rest, that genuine wisdom knows the difference between helping and enabling, between support and sacrifice. They learn to recognize the difference between empathy and enmeshment. Empathy says, "I understand your pain." Enmeshment says, "Your pain is my responsibility." Empathy creates connection. Enmeshment creates confusion. Empathy respects boundaries. Enmeshment dissolves them. The empath who snapped and then healed learns to live in empathy without drowning in enmeshment, to extend care without extending themselves beyond sustainability. And perhaps most importantly, they learn that snapping was not failure, but transformation. That the breaking was not weakness, but reckoning. That the moment they stopped being everything to everyone was the moment they started becoming someone to themselves. The old version had to die for the new one to emerge. Not a loss, but a birth. Painful, messy, necessary. There's a particular kind of grief in recognizing that you spent years betraying yourself in the name of loving others, that you abandoned your own needs while meeting everyone else's, that you learned to read every signal except your own. This grief is valid and important. It needs space, time, witness, but it also needs to be released eventually. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because the present and future do. The empath who has healed carries a different energy now. They're still sensitive, still perceptive, still capable of deep understanding. But there's a groundedness that wasn't there before, a centeredness, a quiet strength that comes not from enduring everything, but from knowing what to accept and what to refuse, what to carry and what to set down, when to engage and when to withdraw. They no longer see their sensitivity as a curse to be managed or a gift to be given away. It's simply part of who they are, one aspect among many, valuable but not defining. They've learned to use their perceptiveness not just to understand others, but to understand themselves. To notice when they're slipping into old patterns. To recognize when they're prioritizing peacekeeping over peacemaking, when they're avoiding conflict at the cost of authenticity, when they're performing care rather than offering it freely. This new way of being confuses people who knew the old version. They wonder why the empath is less available, less responsive, less accommodating. Some accuse them of becoming selfish or cold. But the empath knows now that prioritizing their own well-being is not selfishness, it's self-preservation. And self-preservation is not optional. It's the foundation upon which everything else is built. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot care for others sustainably if you never care for yourself. In the end, the story of the empath who snapped is not a cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much. It's a liberation story about what happens when you realize that caring for everyone except yourself is not love, it's self-erasure. It's about the courage required to stop performing strength and admit you're tired, about the wisdom in recognizing that not every problem is yours to solve, not every emotion is yours to process, not every person is yours to save. It's about understanding that true empathy includes seeing yourself with the same compassion you extend to others, holding space for your own struggles with the same gentleness you offer to friends, believing in your own worth without needing to earn it through service. It's about learning that you can be soft without being depleted, open without being defenseless, loving without being lost. The day the empath snapped was not the end of their story. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life where sensitivity becomes strength rather than sacrifice, where understanding serves connection rather than control, where care flows outward from a full well rather than draining from a desperate attempt to fill others with what you don't possess yourself. In the quiet moments now, when they sit alone with themselves, a practice they once avoided, they feel something new, not the heavy, anxious hyper-awareness of everyone else's emotional state. Not the constant scanning for danger, need, distress in others, but a simple, profound presence with what is, with what they feel, with who they are beneath all the roles, all the expectations, all the learned patterns of self-sacrifice. And in that presence there is peace, not the false peace of avoiding conflict or the temporary peace of solving someone else's problem, but the deep, sustainable peace that comes from being aligned with yourself, from no longer betraying your own needs in service of others' comfort, from finally understanding that you were never meant to be a savior, just a whole, imperfect, beautifully human person, learning to navigate this complex world without losing yourself in the process. This is the wisdom that emerges from breaking, that you cannot hold space for others if you don't first hold space for yourself. That boundaries are not barriers, but the very thing that allows genuine connection. That self-care is not selfish but sacred, that you can love the world without letting it consume you. That sensitivity is a strength, but only when protected, honored and balanced with the kind of fierce self-love that refuses to abandon yourself ever again. So when you see someone who seems to have changed, who's less available than they used to be, who no longer rushes to rescue or fix or carry, consider that they haven't become cold. They've become whole. They haven't stopped caring. They've started including themselves in the circle of care. They haven't lost their empathy. They've found their boundaries, and that's not something to mourn. It's something to celebrate. Because the empath who learns to protect their gift while honoring their humanity becomes something remarkable. Not a limitless resource for others to drain, but a sustainable source of genuine care, offered freely from fullness rather than frantically from emptiness. They become living proof that you can be deeply compassionate without being completely consumed, that you can feel everything and still choose yourself. That breaking open can lead not to permanent brokenness but to breakthrough, to a way of being that honors both the gift of perception and the necessity of protection. This is not the end of empathy. This is its evolution, from unconscious absorption to conscious choice, from self-sacrifice to self-integration, from drowning in others' depths to swimming skillfully in your own. The empath didn't snap because they were weak. They snapped because they were strong, strong enough to finally say enough, strong enough to choose themselves, strong enough to begin the difficult work of becoming whole. And in that wholeness, they discover what they'd been searching for all along in others: acceptance, understanding, compassion, care. But now it flows from within, sustainable and true. They become to themselves what they'd always been to others: a safe place, a gentle witness, a source of unconditional regard. And from that foundation, they can offer genuine care to the world without disappearing into it, can extend empathy without losing themselves, can love fully while remaining whole. This is the gift that emerges from the breaking. The understanding that you were always deserving of the care you gave so freely to others, that your worth was never contingent on your usefulness, that your sensitivity was meant to enrich your life, not drain it. And once you know this, truly know it in your bones, in your breath, in your rebuilt boundaries, you become unbreakable. Not because you're hard, but because you're integrated. Not because you've closed your heart, but because you've finally opened it to include yourself. The day the empath snapped was the day they stopped abandoning themselves, and everything that followed was simply the beautiful, messy, necessary journey home. Yet even in this homecoming, there are moments when the old pull returns. They witness someone struggling and feel the familiar urge to dive in, to fix, to save. The difference now is awareness. They pause, they breathe. They ask, "Is this mine to carry? Can I help without harming myself?" These questions once would have felt selfish. Now they feel like wisdom, because the empath has learned that not all help is helpful, that sometimes the kindest thing is to trust people to handle their own struggles, that rescuing others from consequences often robs them of growth. This doesn't mean indifference. They still care deeply. But they've learned to care from strength rather than depletion, to be present without being consumed. They've learned the difference between empathy and codependency, between compassion and compulsion. Because beneath the helping was always a hidden wound. The belief that if they could just give enough, they would finally earn love. That their value was measured in usefulness. And so they gave from deficit, trying to fill an inner void by filling everyone else's needs, never realizing that external validation cannot heal an internal wound. The healing comes when they turn toward themselves with the same care they'd always given others. When they start asking, "What do you need? What would feel good?" And then, this is the radical part, actually honoring those answers even when it means disappointing someone else, even when it means standing alone. Standing alone once terrified them. But through the breaking and rebuilding they discovered solitude is not loneliness. Being alone is not abandonment. And the peace of not being needed is deeper than the validation of being relied upon. In solitude, they discovered lost parts of themselves, interests buried under others' agendas, dreams postponed, preferences forgotten. Slowly they began to reclaim these, to reassemble an identity independent of relationships, usefulness, ability to soothe and solve and support. And as this self emerges, tentative but undeniably real, something remarkable happens. The relationships that survived begin to deepen. Because now, instead of a mirror reflecting only what others want to see, people encounter an actual person. Real intimacy becomes possible. Not the false intimacy of endless absorption, but true intimacy of two whole people choosing vulnerability while remaining intact. These relationships feel lighter despite being more authentic. There's natural reciprocity rather than unspoken contracts. No imbalanced dynamic. Instead of flow, sometimes you need support, sometimes I do, without keeping score, without perpetual sacrifice. Learning to receive becomes the final frontier, to let someone care for them without guilt, to accept help without feeling weak, to say, "I'm not okay," and let that statement stand, be witnessed, matter. This vulnerability is harder than any burden they carried, because carrying was familiar. Being vulnerable in return, that's revolutionary. The irony is profound. Years of being safe space for others' vulnerability, yet never vulnerable in return. Holding space for every emotion except their own, witnessing everyone's humanity while hiding their own. And now, in learning to be human, flawed, needy, limited, they discover what they'd been missing. Being truly seen, not as function, but as person, worthy of care simply for existing. This journey teaches them about strength. Real strength is not enduring everything without breaking. Real strength is breaking when you need to, falling apart when that's the only honest response, then having courage to reassemble yourself differently, more sustainably. Strength is not stoicism. It's surrender to your limits, your needs, your humanity. The greatest gift from this transformation, the ability to model this truth for others. Somewhere, another empath is drowning. Someone else is absorbing everyone's emotions while neglecting their own, performing endless compassion while slowly disappearing. When they encounter someone who used to be like them but now lives differently, boundaried, whole, self-honoring, it plants a seed, a possibility, a permission to stop, to rest, to prioritize their own well-being without shame, to recognize they're not responsible for everyone's emotional state, cannot heal wounds they didn't cause. This transmission of possibility may be the most valuable gift the recovered empath offers. Not endless availability, but living proof that another way exists. Because the world doesn't need more people who sacrifice themselves on the altar of others' comfort. The world needs people who have learned to honor their own needs while still caring about collective well-being. People who understand that you cannot create sustainable change from a place of depletion. People who know that self-love is not the opposite of compassion, but its foundation. People who have discovered that the most radical act in a world that demands endless giving is to finally receive, to finally rest, to finally say, I matter too. The empath who snapped and then healed becomes a quiet revolutionary, not through grand gestures or public declarations, but through the simple, profound act of living as a whole person, by refusing to disappear into others' needs. By maintaining their center even in the chaos of others' crises, by demonstrating that sensitivity need not equal suffering, that feeling deeply doesn't require drowning, that you can have an open heart without having no boundaries. They still care, they still see, they still feel the undercurrents that others miss, but now they also see themselves. They feel their own fatigue, their own limits, their own needs. And they honor what they see and feel, not as obstacles to overcome, but as information to respect. They've learned that their internal signals are just as valid as external demands, that their own discomfort is just as worthy of attention as someone else's, that protecting their peace is not selfish but sacred. In the end, this is what the story teaches, that every empath must eventually choose between endless service and sustainable presence, between being everything to everyone and being something real to a few, between the performance of perpetual strength and the authenticity of acknowledged humanity. The snap is not failure. The snap is the moment when unsustainable patterns finally meet their limit. And what comes after, the rebuilding, the reclaiming, the return to self, is not weakness. It's wisdom, hard-won, necessary, beautiful wisdom. So if you recognize yourself in this story, if you've felt the weight of everyone's emotions pressing down on you, if you've wondered when it will be your turn to rest, to be held, to be seen, know this. You don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to earn the right to care for yourself. You don't have to snap before you're allowed to set the burden down. You can choose right now to begin treating yourself with the same compassion you so freely give others. You can start honoring your needs before they become emergencies. You can practice boundaries before you're completely depleted. The day you stop abandoning yourself doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be quiet, simple. A moment when you notice the familiar pull to rescue, to fix, to carry, and you choose differently. A moment when you say no without explaining. A moment when you put yourself first without apologizing. A moment when you recognize that your worth is not contingent on your usefulness, that you are valuable simply because you exist, that you deserve rest and care and tenderness, not because you've earned it, but because you're human. That moment, whenever it comes, is your homecoming, your return to the self you never should have had to leave, your reclamation of the energy you've been pouring into everyone else. Your first step toward a life where empathy enhances your experience rather than erasing it, where sensitivity is protected rather than exploited, where care flows from fullness rather than desperation. And when you finally arrive home to yourself, when you finally feel the peace of being aligned with your own needs and boundaries, when you finally experience the relief of not having to save anyone, including yourself from yourself, you'll understand that the snap wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was all the years before it, when you believed that disappearing was the price of love, that exhaustion was the proof of care, that you had to lose yourself to be worthy of being found. But now you know differently. Now you know that the greatest love includes self-love. Now you know that true strength embraces limits. Now you know that you can be deeply compassionate without being completely consumed. And this knowing changes everything. It changes how you move through the world, how you engage with others, how you define yourself, how you protect your energy, how you spend your time, how you measure your worth. The empath who snapped didn't break. They broke through the illusions of unlimited capacity, through the conditioning that said their needs didn't matter, through the fear that being unavailable meant being unlovable, through the belief that sacrifice was the same as service. They broke through to the other side, where wholeness awaits, where peace is possible, where you can be both sensitive and strong, both open and boundaried, both caring and self-preserved. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the empath writes their own narrative instead of being written into everyone else's, where they choose themselves without guilt, where they rest without shame, where they exist as a full person, not a half-empty vessel waiting to be filled with others' needs. This is the chapter where they learn that coming home to yourself is not abandonment of others. It's the only way to genuinely show up for them without losing yourself in the process. And that, finally, is the truth that sets them free.